All right, so getting right back to where we left off last time, we're going to continue talking about Chapter 17 and the growth of really industry throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Last time we talked a little bit about the time frame with which this occurs and some of the basic concepts like scientific management and ideas like that. Today we're going to get in a little more of the business side of things to a certain degree. So why don't we go ahead and get right to it? Okay, so corporations um, basically are any group of multiple investors into a larger company. What makes a regular business a corporation is when they have a large number of investors that have a stake in the success of a company. Um, it could be, really as few as four or five, but as many as hundreds or even more, all depending on the makeup and the setup of that particular, um, of that particular company. So it all depends on who owns it and whatever that structure might be. Okay. Um, Corporations largely are derived from or emerged late in the 19th century out of the railroad industry. Okay, late in the 19th century, America is looking really to expand its railroad base. So railroads start springing up all over the country because we want people moving out west and we want easier access to the resources that are available in the west. So one of the big players in this game of railroad expansion is actually the federal government. And the government offers subsidies to people that are interested in building a railroad. So, say for instance, you get a group of investors and they want to build a railroad that's going to cost, say, $100 million, which would not be what the cost was back then, but anyway, to make it easy. And you and your group of investors are able to put up or get 60 million of that $100 million through loans and money that you're able to put up for it. The federal government will provide a subsidy that'll account for that other 40 million. The subsidy is an amount of money that you won't have to pay back, if the railroad doesn't work out or whatever. But the government wants to see this happen, and the government essentially has, I don't want to say infinite, but a large degree of financial resources available to make, to make these things happen. Okay, so what we see is a lot of industrious figures. They'll get their money together and look to form a corporation that is focused on building the railroad and whether it wherever it connects. But and railroads essentially make their money by charging the freight rates, the cost. If I own a railroad, I may not own all the trains that travel it, but some of the trains that ride my railroad have to pay a fee for utilizing that railroad. It may be based on the number of train cars. It may be based on the amount of weight that train carries. And that's how these railroad companies make their money. So from the 1870s to the 1890s, early 1890s, we have a major railroad bubble that builds in the United States as more and more people try to invest in the railroads. Okay, and that helps build the concept of growing corporations. Now, another concept to kind of talk about here is this idea of something we call limited liability. Okay, this is something that helps drive the stock market and stuff like that today. Limited liability is great for companies that want to grow and increase their capital. Capital meaning money that they have to use and expand. Basically, limited liability states that I'm only liable for the amount of money that I invested in a particular company, right? So if I invested $10,000 in a company and I lose that $10,000 and the company fails. I don't owe anything on the debts that a company may owe afterward. I only lose what my investment amount is, right? So the smart investor, the savvy investor will say, okay, I can afford to invest $10,000. And if I lose that $10,000, it's not going to break me. Okay, so I can still do okay. But if it works out and the company grows, that 10,000 becomes much more money. So I don't have as much risk associated with it. If I were to say, rather than investing 10,000, I'm going to start my own company that's going to cost me $100,000, but I can really only afford 50,000. Okay, because then if the company fails, now I have creditors, I have people that I owe money to, that I owe loans to, that are going to want that 50,000, and then they may take assets from me. They could take my home or other things I own that I put up as collateral for the loan that I took out, to start my company. But with limited liability, that's kind of gone. I'm just investing my money, trying to make more. It's how the stock market works. If I invest $1,000 in the stock market and that stock goes up in value, I've made money. If it cuts in half in value and the stock that I invested in is now only worth $500 of the 1,000 I initially invested, well, I don't owe $500 or anything like that. I don't owe $500 more or anything. So, I can again only lose what I invest. So basically, you can only lose what you're comfortable or able to lose. But the great thing about limited liability, again, if you get a bunch of people together, they can invest, they can help create more capital for a company to expand and grow. So this is something that becomes more common and popular late in the 19th century. Two companies that kind of drive business during this time, of course, are Carnegie Steel, that's Andrew Carnegie's company, and Standard Oil, which is John D. Rockefeller. They both use different processes to build their company, but are both very, very successful in their own right. The two biggest companies of this era, right? What they do is a new kind of management and business organizational structure known as horizontal or vertical integration. Okay, Carnegie Steel practiced largely vertical integration. Standard Oil practiced a little bit of both, but is a little more known for horizontal integration. With Carnegie Steel and vertical integration, it works like this. Okay, Carnegie is in the steel industry. So he starts off with the iron ore, wherever the ore comes from, the mines that the ore comes from, and he owns the mines. He owns the railroads that transport the ore from the mines to to the steel plants, the factories where they make the steel. He owns obviously all the steel plants that produce and make the steel, and he owns the distributorship of where that steel is distributed. In other words, in vertical integration, you own every step of the production process. The goal is to maximize profit while minimizing your own personal cost. Okay? For instance, if I were McDonald's, right? Not only would I own the stores where the food is sold, but I would own the farms where we raise the cattle and the cows. I would own the meat packing plants where those cows are turned into beef. I would own the packaging plants where we make the packaging for the food, and I would own the truck companies that transport the food to the different stores. That's how vertical integration works. Horizontal integration is also a method of lowering your own costs and maximizing profits while also trying to get rid of competition. And horizontal integration, which was more commonly used by Rockefeller would basically buy up other smaller companies that produced the same thing as him, more of a horizontal thing. So if I'm Rockefeller, not only do I own Standard Oil, but I own other oil producers as well. An example would be, we'll say if Rockefeller was BP, He would also own Shell. He would own Sunoco. He would own Speedway. He would own Marathon. He would own anybody else or as many other people as he can that produces gas, that produces oil. This way, he owns a better market share of that particular industry and Standard Oil allows himself to kind of control the industry more effectively, control pricing, and increase his own profit margins. So that is how horizontal integration works. Now, another thing that we see that emerges during this time is the concept of the holding company. And this kind of goes into the idea of limited liability, and it's still commonplace today. We use other terms sometimes like private equity, hedge funds, venture capital to describe the same thing. A holding company is a company that buys up companies that produce a particular, small companies that produce a particular good. Or service. And they get investors to invest in that particular company. The investors are there, of course, to make money. See, the difference here with a Carnegie, with a John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was an oil guy. Carnegie was a steel guy, meaning, they knew about their industry. J.P. Morgan, financier, who had a lot of holding companies, he was a money guy. He didn't know much about how the steel industry worked or anything like that, but he knew how to make money. And how you make money is by growing, getting investors, and building up companies to become bigger and more powerful and influential. Okay? The most noteworthy acquisition that J.P. Morgan makes is U.S. Steel that he created when he bought Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie, briefly making Carnegie the richest man in the world. J.P. Morgan bought U.S. Steel from Andrew Carnegie, combined it with several other steel companies he owned, and created U.S. Steel, which I believe is still the world's largest steel company. He does the same thing with Thomas Edison. He buys a bunch of smaller electric companies and companies that produce, light bulbs and other electric-based goods, and buys Edison Electric from Thomas Edison and builds it into a big company, a holding company called General Electric, right? How these companies work further is you leverage your investors by saying, hey, you take out a loan or whatever you do to get your capital together to invest in this company. And the dividends that you'll get from that will essentially pay off any debts you owe. Or you leverage it against the value of the company that you're buying, presuming that building a larger company is going to mean making more money. Does it always work? No, but it is a new way of establishing further control. Okay? A holding company has typically a controlling interest in a company, meaning they own more than 50% of a particular business. The more of a company they own, the more outstanding stock they buy up, the more of the company they control and own. Okay? Usually the entrepreneur, in U.S. Steel's case at Carnegie, has the entrepreneurial mindset where he doesn't want to be owned or controlled by, somebody else. So you don't have a situation where somebody like that wants to be part of a holding company, right? They want to sell and maybe invest their money in doing something else. And that gives more control to the holding company, which acquires the business and produces essentially, ultimately, more wealth for the people involved with that particular acquisition. This happens a lot still today. We hear all the time. The book refers to it as combinations. What we typically call it nowadays are like mergers, acquisitions, and stuff like that. But you hear all the time about company A buying company B and being larger and expanding. People talk about Disney, how big that's getting, because they got like Fox and Marvel and ESPN and all this other stuff. That's essentially a holding company or an umbrella company that controls many others. Because we see this horizontal integration take place, it results in kind of the birth of monopolistic practice. Monopolies are an interesting thing. They're good to a point. They're certainly good for the people that are making the money, but monopolies can also be bad for the consumer because the consumer, can stand to lose because with less competition, prices can be driven up. So consumer prices are driven up, and when monopolies get to a certain level of power and influence, they can drive other companies out of an industry, right? They can become so influential and so powerful that, to drive other competition out, they can price gouge, which means lowering prices temporarily to drive out competition. And that is the downside of monopoly. Okay, but that is something that is going to be dealt with in the future. All right, so moving on. Just really quick, who are the biggest names that dominate American business during this era? Number one, you have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who makes his fortune in the railroad industry. You have, obviously, Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry, Rockefeller in the oil industry, J.P. Morgan in finance, and Henry Ford in the automotive industry a little bit later into the early 20th century. The question is, how do these men change America forever? Okay? These men are really, really important in terms of driving America forward and leading the country towards its future. Okay? Their influence is huge, and they help make America, going into the 20th century, really the industrial force and power that it is. And these men are referred to as titans of business, right? Their practices weren't always the fairest or the best, but their influence is certainly really, really important. And the rich people of today, the mega rich people out there, the Bill Gateses and the Warren Buffetts and the Jeff Bezos, those folks, are always kind of compared to these early titans of business, or sometimes they're referred to as robber barons, because of their immense impact on the future of America. Whether we like them or not, their influence is really, really important, and they really, really help grow America and make it the country it is today. All right, just take a look. We talked about railroads late in the century. Look, if you think back to several chapters ago where we looked at where railroads were in about 1860, right? If you look at all these from 1870 to 1890, look at how much more railroad we've added. All that red there is all new railroad lines, okay? So we're really expanding and blowing up railroads during this time period, leading the country forward. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is the other side of capitalism, the critics of it, the people that, realize that part of what is happening maybe isn't always great for the country. And part of this goes to the ideology of survival of the fittest. The social problem that comes with the rise of industry is, of course, the problem of the very wealthy getting much wealthier while the poor or the lower classes stay where they are. It's about wealth distribution. It's about a limited amount of wealth being given to the very many people, and 90% of the wealth being given to very few people. Okay? And that is the social problem. As these people get wealthy and wealthier and wealthier, so many people are left behind, and something has to be done about that. Okay? Now we say survival of the fittest, and this, of course, goes to the concept of social Darwinism, which I think is also on the slide, but I don't remember. The ideology of individualism suggests that these people that made their money and made their wealth did so because they worked really, really hard to do it. they weren't going to be stopped. We mentioned this the other day, how, like the Thomas Edison, who failed and failed and failed again, eventually found success because they weren't willing to stop until they did. And that's a mindset, right? And that's great. And that's part of that ideology of individualism. But you can also take that ideology, there we go, and use social Darwinism to try to, as we say here, legitimize the wealth that these people have acquired. And the wealthy people, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, these people, they use the idea of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, to legitimize their wealth, right? They believe and they say that, with the idea of only the strong surviving, they say everybody has the same opportunity to get just as rich and wealthy as everyone else. Okay? The wealthy use this argument to explain that the wealth that they've acquired is fairly acquired because it was achieved through hard work and ingenuity rather than simply being lucky or having the right circumstances. So, therefore, the idea of social Darwinism is used, survival of the fittest is used to say we're more fit than the other people. Other people that tried and failed to become wealthy only failed because they weren't capable, because they weren't smart enough. Okay? Is there a bit of truth to that? Yeah, but not completely. Some of these guys did rise to power and influence because they worked really, really hard. Andrew Carnegie worked really, really hard. John Rockefeller worked really, really hard. But some of them also became wealthy because they were born into a position of wealth. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, like a J.P. Morgan, his father was a wealthy banker and he expanded on that wealth. So it's not simply always just your hard work that allows you to be successful. There's always a little bit of that luck and circumstance too, right? Rockefeller was lucky to drill in places where oil was found. Somebody else could have gone to that same spot and done the same thing. He just happened to be the guy, right? So yes, these people work extremely hard to achieve their goals, but they also, they also did have a little bit of being in the right place at the right time and a little bit of luck to help them acquire this. But anyway, the wealthy during this era used this concept again of social Darwinism to legitimize the wealth they've acquired and the opportunities that they've taken advantage of. Now, as kind of an aside to the criticism of capitalism, it begins the idea that the wealthy need to do more to help society. And this gives birth to the idea of philanthropy. Philanthropy is, of course, is the idea of giving your wealth and giving the things that you have to help causes, charity, and stuff like that. This is all born from a essay, basically, that was written by Andrew Carnegie that was called Wealth, and later kind of became known as the Gospel of Wealth. And what the Gospel of Wealth talks about, in fact, we'll call it super important AP point number 19, I think, the Gospel of Wealth, right? That it is the responsibility of the very, very wealthy, the very, very rich, to give back to society, to contribute back to society to help those that have less. And we see that still today, where philanthropy is a big, big thing. Just now they were talking about, I forget who it was, but there was some super rich person that started this, 50%, give back half of your wealth to charity, to, help different causes and things like that. So philanthropy is a big thing, and the concept of philanthropy is really born from Andrew Carnegie and the Gospel of Wealth, saying it is a responsibility of these very wealthy people to give some of what they have back to better society. We see Carnegie do this through, Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie Hall in New York. He opened up many, many public libraries all over the country, Rockefeller. You see things named after Rockefeller. Rockefeller Center in New York. Rockefeller Plaza. There's places, there's museums and things named after Rockefeller. The Vanderbilts have Vanderbilt University. So these people give back, use their wealth and position to a certain degree to help society. And that whole idea is born from this writing and this idea brought about by Andrew Carnegie. In fact, Andrew Carnegie, he was worth like 400 and some million dollars when he died, which today would be $100 billion. And he donated all but 20 million of his personal wealth to charities when he died. He left 20 million for his two kids, which is plenty of money certainly to survive on. But he was so committed to giving so much of that wealth away to better society. We also see the stories of guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie, immigrants or children of immigrants that came over to America to seek wealth and opportunity, played out in a lot of the literature of the time. And these stories, particularly the stories of Horatio Alger, are all these rags to rich tales, written about young men that work really, really hard to achieve, wealth. And these become really, really popular late in the 1800s. Books like Chester Rand and Ragged Dick, which are two of his more famous stories, are these stories that are really driven towards helping young people pursue the dream of becoming very successful, becoming the next Rockefeller, becoming the next Carnegie or Vanderbilt or whoever. So a big piece of our social fabric late in this century, even though it was reserved for so few people, was this push to achieve wealth and opportunity. And we see that play out in many different forms. Okay, so that's all I have for today. I know that one went a little bit long, but we'll get the last piece in for you tomorrow, and that's all. All right, see you later.